Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Should I charge my child rent? Social security issues that family members need to know. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Nikki Mitchell. Hi, Nikki. Can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, and then I'll turn everything over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So my name is Nikki Mitchell. I am actually I'll just go to my next slide, so it'll tell you a little bit about me. So I am an elder law and special needs planning attorney. My office is based out of Kirkwood. I am the owner of Mitchell Brown and Associates. I went to the University of Maryland School of Law, and right after graduating, worked as a legal aid attorney doing several things, but a lot of disability related work, social security stuff, special education, and elder law. And then when I moved out here to St. Louis in 2015, decided that if I was going to get a license in Missouri and start working out here, I wanted to try and get into the elder law and special needs planning field more specifically. And for any of you who might be familiar with Martha Brown, who owned this practice before she retired, she just so happened to be needing an attorney at that time. And it was kind of serendipitous that I came on, and the rest is history, so they say. So I am a member of the Special Needs Alliance, which is an invitation-only group of special needs planners, which means you have to have a certain focus of your firm on special needs planning for people with disabilities. And so I do a lot of work with families who and people who have disabilities, or have children with disabilities, or family members with disabilities. So we're going to be talking tonight about something that comes up so often in my practice, especially with people who are in that transition planning phase of things where, your child has been living at home and is turning 18 now. And, we're kind of trying to figure out all these next steps, right? That whole list of things you have to think about for what you have to take care of now. One of them being applying for Social Security benefits, and what is that going to look like, and how are you going to navigate the many, many rules that are tied to getting those benefits, right? So little roadmap for what we're going to go through today is to just generally talk about the basics of SSI rules, because I think it's important to understanding why rent even matters. Why is that even a thing we need to worry about? We'll talk about what is in-kind support and maintenance, again, for that same reason. We need to understand what that is in order to understand why charging your own child rent makes a difference. How do we prevent a reduction in benefits? And then we'll work through some scenarios that I've put together, and then leave plenty of time for questions. I know that there were some pre-submitted questions people have. So let's dive into it, right? So we'll talk about the basics of SSI. And what SSI stands for is Supplemental Security Income. A lot of times people will say to me, well, I'm on disability, right? Well, that doesn't give me a whole lot of information, because there's several different versions of disability within the Social Security Administration's purview. But the one that is for people who have not paid into the Social Security system is the SSI. This is for people who either have not worked at all or have not worked enough quarters to be eligible for SSDI. And SSI is the program that pays just a fixed monthly amount. We'll talk about all of that in a minute. And it has the most rules tied to it, as far as what you can have and what you can earn. The primary place where we are going to find all of the rules surrounding what you can and can't have and earn as far as Social Security goes is found in what Social Security calls their POMS, their Program Operations Manual System. And I've got here on the screen just sort of a screenshot of what the homepage for the SSI program looks like. The POMS are what the caseworkers at Social Security will use to make determinations on cases. So the POMS are not law, they're not even regulations. They are just kind of like a guidebook or a handbook that the Social Security Administration has put together, interpreting the laws and the handbook, or I'm sorry, and the regulations for their caseworkers to do their jobs. But because this is the place where the laws and regulations are being interpreted, and this is really the only place where the caseworkers are looking to know how to do one thing or another, this is the place that is really important to people who do the kind of thing that I do, to checking on what is the current policy about how Social Security is going to look at one thing or another, right? So I have this page bookmark on my computer. I look at it all the time. So there's links as we go through here to the extent that it was relevant. I've put like a citation to the actual sections of the POMS where it's on the slide for different sections. So you can always go and click on that if you really wanted to. One other thing I also want to note for people who are going to go looking into the POMS for what the rules are is, again, because these are not law, because they're not regulations, they are not subject to the same kinds of formal procedural requirements that laws and regulation changes are. If Social Security Administration wants to change a law, Congress has to do that. If they want to change a regulation, they have to go through a formal rulemaking progress. If they want to change the POMS, they just go in here and change it. And then where these circles are, they'll put a new date on there, right? So they don't have to follow any formal process at all. So sometimes I could have gone in here 2 months ago and looked at something and it might say one thing, and I come later and I see a newer date on these red circles. They've come in here, they've changed something. It's not necessarily some major overhaul of the policy, but it's something has been changed in here. So I always like to point out to people to just pay attention to that. If I were relying on a section of the POMS for some position that I'm taking, I always print out or save in some way that section and highlight the date that I'm using and say, I'm using the version of this that's valid as of, this date. So again, I don't imagine that the general public is very much going to be kind of hanging out doing this and as light reading, but if you are, just be mindful of that. So SSI is needs-based. And what does that mean? SSI is meant to provide benefits for people who cannot provide those things for themselves. And generally that right now means the government is giving you money to pay for food and shelter because you cannot earn enough money to pay for those things yourself. And because of that, they have set in the rules and the regulations these limits on what you can have and what you can earn in order to be eligible for this program. So SSI has an asset limit of $2,000. That number has not changed in 40 years. It's been $2,000 since almost the inception of the SSI program. There is currently pending a bill in Congress called the SSI Savings Penalty Elimination Act that would increase this number for an individual to $10,000, and the asset limit for a married couple is $3,000. So this bill would increase that to $20,000. And both of those things would be indexed for inflation. So every year when Social Security benefits get changed for that cost of living increase, so would that resource limit, right? So that would be a massive, massive change for this program where they haven't increased this limit in decades. This was actually introduced for the first time last session with Congress. It didn't really go anywhere. It's been introduced again. Hasn't really moved yet, but there's some momentum. So if it's something you would want to support, contact your congressperson and let them know that you do support it. The $2,000 limit does exclude some things. So you are allowed to have some stuff that doesn't count toward the $2,000. And one of those is your primary residence. You can have one car of any value. In the last 8 years, since about 2016, you've been able to have an ABLE account with an amount of up to $100,000 in it, and that will not count for SSI purposes. You can also have a prepaid burial plan so long as the contract is irrevocable. There are some other things that are kind of more obscure that don't apply so generally to people. So I haven't included them on here. They're more to do like if you're a full-time student and things like that. So they're not on here. This is the basic list of things that don't count toward the $2,000. So anything that else really, bank accounts, if you've got more than one car, more than one house, things like that. If you've got four-wheelers and tractors and things like that, that stuff would technically count toward the $2,000. SSI also has an income limit, right? So it counts both earned and unearned income. Because remember, again, the idea for this program is you cannot earn enough income yourself to pay for your own food and shelter. So they're giving you money to do that. Another thing to keep in mind is that income and assets can be deemed to a minor child from their parents. The policy reasoning behind that is if you have a child under 18, you have a parental duty to provide for them. And so if you have income or assets sufficient to do that, then even if you have a child who meets the disability requirements for SSI, they wouldn't meet the financial piece of that. So a lot of what we'll talk about tonight is going to focus on this income piece of things because it is more directly related to how rent is going to come into play. So earned income, I think, is the much more straightforward piece of this, right? So earned income is wages, right? If you go out and you have a job, you're going to get paid. That is earned income. If you're self-employed, then the net earnings from that employment is going to be considered earned income. If you have payments from a sheltered workshop or similar work, that's also going to be earned income. Things like royalties, if you get them, these are not, I don't know that I've ever seen a client that had royalties who was on SSI, but if you did, those would also count as earned income because you are receiving that money because you put some sort of product out into the world that you're getting money for. Earned income is excluded is treated differently than unearned income. So there is a general income exclusion that applies to both earned and unearned income of $20. So that's going to come off no matter what. In addition to that, the first $65 of earned income is going to be taken off. If you have, and these, we're not going to do a deep dive into what this looks like or how these are calculated, but if you had earned income that was used to pay impairment related work expenses or IRWE expenses, those could come off of your, those would be excluded as well. And then 1/2 of the remaining earned income is deducted from your SSI payment. And I'll show you an example in just a minute of kind of a calculation of what that might look like. Unearned income is all income that is not earned from all other sources, right? So while it seems like that should be more straightforward, we will see as we talk about some of these other things, how it can get really sort of tricky. Unearned income is also deducted differently from your monthly payment, and they don't count certain things as unearned income. So again, you get that $20 just general exclusion. They also don't count food stamps. They don't count energy assistance if you have any of that for your household. If you have a HUD subsidy for rent, they do not count that. If you have WIC benefits, that's not income. So let's look at how they're looking at your benefit to change how much you get per month, right? In 2024, if you're on SSI and you're getting the full amount, you're getting $943 per month. If you have earned income, they'll take that off. If you have unearned income, they'll take that off. If you have in-kind support and maintenance, which we'll talk about in a second, they take that off. After all of those things come off, we'll come up with a number, and that's what your monthly payment equals, which could be zero. You could get nothing, depending on how many deductions you have, right? So let's look at an example. We start at 943. Everybody starts at 943. It's not different. You've got, let's say you have $200 of earned income. Let's say you had $300 of unearned income that counted. Let's say you had in-kind support and maintenance of $314.33, and you'll see how that number becomes important in just a minute when we talk about the other stuff. They deduct all of that, and you only get $128.67 per month, right? So when you're dealing with SSI, look at how many things you're having to keep track of to figure out whether you're going to get a deduction in your monthly payment, right? So many rules, and all of those things have different rules we're thinking about. So to the extent we can try to take out one of these things from being a consideration, we're making our lives a little bit easier. And that's why charging the rent can take one thing off the table, and that can be this in-kind support and maintenance. In-kind support and maintenance is, sorry, I wanted to make one point. I want to go back. A study recently showed that nationally, for every person who's receiving SSI, the average monthly payment people are getting right now is about $560. So, which tells you that so many people have some kind of deduction coming out for something, right? If the average is 560, then we've got a ton of people who are getting reductions of some kind in order to get it down that low. Okay. In-kind support and maintenance is a term that is used to reflect this idea that SSI, again, meant to pay for someone's food and shelter. If someone else is paying for your food and shelter, then you are receiving in-kind support and maintenance, or ISM. Some people call it ISM, doesn't matter, same thing. I'll point out on here, the reason I have a little star next to the food is there is a proposed rule. Remember, I mentioned earlier this idea that when Social Security Administration wants to change a regulation, they have to go through this formal rulemaking process. They did that, and in February of 2023, they started a proposed rulemaking process to change their regulations to remove food as a consideration for this. Which means that they would no longer ask questions about food and who's paying for it. They wouldn't consider food as part of the in-kind support and maintenance. It really just would be taken off the table completely. They did this back in 2011-ish, if I'm remembering the date right, for clothing, because it used to be food, clothing, and shelter, and they took clothing off of that list several years ago. So now they're talking about doing it with food as well. So the comment period for that has closed, but they have not issued a final regulation for the change. I'm told that they expect that they will sometime this year, and they expect that they will issue the rule as it was proposed, which would again remove food from the from counting against all this. But until they do, right now, it still does count. So it is still something to think about. So if someone else is purchasing your food for you, that can count as in-kind support and maintenance. And this includes all food, whether it's purchased and consumed at home. So if you're buying groceries and you're cooking at home and eating at home, whether you are purchasing the food and taking it to someone else's house and eating it, whether it's provided for you by an institution, provided by your landlord or your housemates. Let's say you live somewhere and you pay rent, but you don't buy your own groceries and someone else is doing all that, that all still counts. So from a logistical standpoint, trying to track all of that, like if you have a whole household of people, right? Like just trying to figure out like what portion of the groceries was for one person or whoever, you know, like that is difficult to track on a regular basis, and people do it a bunch of different ways. And then it's also hard for Social Security to try and track it when they're doing their redeterminations and they're asking you, they're running through their list of questions to see if you're following the rules or not, or if you're reporting stuff correctly. It's hard for them to know too, to be honest, like whether things are being done correctly or not. But that is considered food, so all food. And then separately, shelter. Now, shelter is different. So the POMS does specifically have a section. You can see the citation down there in the bottom right corner. Shelter is 10 specific things on this list here. And that is it. So it is not anything that is not on this list. I mean, this list is long enough and does encompass a lot of things that are shelter, but there are some things that are not on here, and that can make a difference when we go through some of our examples later. But shelter includes mortgage, real estate taxes, rent, heating, fuel, gas, electricity, water, sewer, and garbage removal. So if someone else is paying for these things for you, then you are receiving in-kind support and maintenance, and your monthly benefit is going to be reduced. How it's going to be reduced is going to be determined by one of two rules, and we'll talk about those in just a second. You can receive in-kind support and maintenance from someone in the household and from people outside of the household. It can go both ways. These expenses are analyzed on a monthly basis. So even if it's an annual bill, so for example, real estate taxes, they might only get paid once a year. For Social Security purposes, they're going to break that down into a monthly payment and use the monthly amount when they're determining how much ISM there was. And like I said just a minute ago, certain things are not shelter and therefore are not ISM, right? So cell phone payments, cable bills, insurance, which includes homeowners insurance and car insurance and things like that, they are not on that list. Therefore, they're not shelter. Those can be paid and will not have any effect on the monthly payment. I mentioned a second ago that part of this process is determining which rule to apply when figuring out how much ISM we have, right? One of those rules is called the value of 1/3 reduction, or the VTR rule. If someone inside the household, which I think will be relevant to a lot of the people who are probably listening today, right? If your child is living in your house with you and you are paying all of the bills and they start receiving SSI money, then there could be a reduction under this VTR rule. The VTR says that if they are receiving food and shelter ISM from someone inside the household, then their monthly benefit amount is reduced by 1/3, right? This rule is an all or nothing situation. So they're not going, Social Security is not going to do a deep dive into calculating the exact value of the ISM. They're just going to say you're receiving ISM from someone inside the household, so we are reducing your payment by 1/3. So, and another thing that is important to note about this is true even if only a portion of the ISM is received from someone inside the household. So you could be receiving ISM technically from someone inside and outside the household. You're still going to get the VTR rule for the inside the household payment, and it's going to be that 1/3 reduction. This is what we are trying to avoid when we have children who are receiving SSI living in the home by having them do some sort of room and board agreement, which we'll talk about. So here's an example. So you have an SSI recipient and their parents are divorced. The SSI recipient lives with his mother, who pays for all the food and the rent for the household. The SSI recipient's father pays for the electric separately as part of their divorce agreement. The SSI recipient's monthly benefit is reduced by 1/3, which in 2024 is going to be $314 for the rent and food that mom provides. And it's not reduced any further because dad pays the electric bill. Okay. A 1/3 reduction is the most it can be reduced. It can't go further below that for ISM. You could have further reductions for earned income and unearned income, as we saw in that example earlier on, right? But if for ISM purposes, it's 1/3. Okay. So it's really important when we're working through this to figure out who's providing the food and shelter or the ISM, or first determining really, is it ISM or not? And if it is, who's providing it, so we know which rule we're working under, and then we kind of know whether we have some wiggle room and how we're going to deal with that or not. So that's rule 1, BTR. Then we've got rule 2, which is the presumed maximum value rule, or the PMV. This one says if an SSI beneficiary is receiving food and shelter from someone outside of the household and no ISM from anyone inside of the household, then the PMV rule applies. And Social Security will reduce your monthly benefit by 1/3 of the monthly benefit rate plus $20. I like to take a minute here because it seems crazy to me, and probably to lots of you, that they went through this whole trouble of making up 2 rules. And the only real difference is who's providing the food and shelter, and then changing it by $20. It doesn't make any sense to me why they would bother doing that. And then the other difference is this rule, remember, BTR is all or nothing. You get a 1/3 reduction. They don't care about the actual value of stuff. This one, they said, well, on this one, it'll be rebuttable, right? So we're going to the starting place is 1/3 plus $20, which in 2024 is $334. If you can prove to us that the actual value of the food and shelter is less than that, then we will not take away as much, right? So if you can show, oh, it's only worth $200, then we'll only reduce it by $200. And you can't do that with BTR. But why Social Security needs to make theirs and your life harder by putting these 2 rules together, I couldn't tell you. I really don't know what the policy reason is for dividing them this way, but these are the rules we have. So this is what we're working with. So again, what we're trying to figure out when we're working with an SSI beneficiary is, are they getting ISM in the first place? Which rule are we working under? If we're working under PMV, can we rebut the assumption that the value is 1/3. And if we can, we have to provide documentation to do that, because the burden is on the SSI beneficiary to prove that. Social Security is not going to put any work into tracking that down. So an example, the SSI recipient lives with a roommate and pays 1/2 of the rent and 1/2 of the utility bills for the apartment. So there is no inside ISM because the SSI recipient pays their fair share of the shelter expenses, right? However, the SSI recipient's parents purchase the groceries each month for the SSI recipient. So the food is considered outside ISM and the PMV reduction is applied. So in this example, again, remember, Social Security's starting point is going to be to apply that full 1/3 plus $20 deduction. But if you can show that the groceries cost less than that, then they will reduce it only by that amount. So that's the added benefit to this rule, is that you can technically get a lower reduction by proving that the value is lower. So that's the PMV. I'm gonna take a quick break. Are there any questions in the Q&A kind of related specifically about these rules before I move on to the next section?
A couple. Let me just, the last question we got, I just wanted you to clarify. It says the rules seem so strict that even if we buy our son a hamburger during the months, we can lose the entire $300 plus for that month, assuming he lives at home with us and we charge him rent. And maybe you're going to get to that next, but are they really checking that closely for a meal here and there, or how does that work?
So there's a couple of things. So I will talk about some strategies for preventing that, number one. And number two, are they checking that kind of thing super closely? Honestly, probably not. I'll be careful on this one. So Social Security has a certain number of caseworkers who can do this work, and a whole lot of people that they need to review stuff for, right? So they're looking for, they have a list of things that they're going to go through and look at. They are not often doing super deep dives on things unless there's some red flag that is kind of being triggered to tell them that they should, right? So, but there are some things we could do that will make it so that it won't matter if they do for you. So you won't lose all the benefits, and you don't have to worry about being that random person they decide to do like a deep dive audit on. So, and we will talk about those a little bit.
Fantastic. There's only one other that really relates to this section, and it's about that rule change. If they were to remove food from the ISM, can you go back mid-year and ask for a reevaluation?
So if you had a deduction, if I'm understanding the question, you're saying you must have had an ISM reduction like for some part of the year, and now the rule's changing. Probably not. The rule is generally going to be only looking forward, not retroactive. So you probably can't do anything about any prior reduction. You can only just make sure you don't get any future ones going forward for the same thing.
There's two more questions, and one of them, the PMV rule seems to penalize people who live in more expensive accommodations, like the certain cities that have higher rents. Any comment on that?
To me, what the PMV rule does is penalize SSI recipients whose disability allows them to live more independently, I think, because these are people whose disability is not so severe that they require some form of institutionalization or live with family members. And so if they're living out in the community kind of on their own, that's expensive and usually does require some outside support. You know, I think I saw a report the other day that said there is not a single city in the United States that an SSI beneficiary could afford a 1-bedroom apartment in right now, right?
For sure.
Anywhere in the country. So so they need outside support in order to afford it. So I think that's what I think that's what all of these rules penalize, frankly, is 943 a month just isn't gonna cover independent living. So
Right.
if you are striving for that, you're not gonna be able to do it on these benefits, really.
Right.
Not without some workarounds.
I, I couldn't agree more. And we've got a question in the chat, which I'll just go ahead and address. And is SSDI the same as SSI? And the answer is no. SSI is supplemental security income. So that's a supplement for people that have not already earned enough income to be eligible for Social Security disability. So that's what SSDI is, Social Security Disability Income. If you've been working for a period of time and paying into the disability system and you can't work anymore, then you could be eligible for SSDI as a former employee who is now disabled. People also get SSDI supplements from their parents' work history if they're individuals with disabilities and a parent passes away. So hopefully I'm saying that correctly. We have additional recorded information about SSDI and SSI that you can access on our YouTube page. And if you ever have any really serious questions about any of these benefits issues, we'll do our best to answer them if you contact us at our main number at the St. Louis ARC and ask for someone in our family support department.
All right, so we've talked about the rules, and I know I just threw a bunch of information, and I even, just really sort of skim the surface of those, really. So let's kind of go into some strategies on how to prevent the reduction, right? We already said 943 is not a ton of money every month to be paying for all of these things. Let's figure out how we can at least get the full benefit of it. Obviously, first thing is, to the extent you can, don't pay for food and shelter for an SSI recipient, right? Are there other things that they need that you can pay for so that you can use the SSI money for the food and shelter, and then you cover the other stuff that they might need? That's sort of the first thing. It's not always practical because it's not always possible given the cost of things. So one of the things that we can do is look at a rental contract. Now, if they get rid of food, rental contracts alone are fine, because then we're only worried about shelter expenses. And so all you need is a rental contract, because that would cover all of the shelter expenses, or should cover all of the shelter expenses, I should say. But both VTR and PNV rules have exclusions that say, if the SSI recipient is paying for their shelter expenses via a rental contract, then there is not going to be a reduction in their benefits. Because when you sign that, you're signing a contract that creates rental liability, and it's a legal obligation for them to contribute toward their own shelter cost. So if they didn't, then the person they sign the contract with could come after them for their share of the money. This is true whether that rental contract is signed between a landlord who also lives in the house with you, or a landlord that lives outside the house. So it could be a parent landlord, any other family member landlord, could just be a friend landlord whose name is on the main lease, but you signed, some separate contract with them, or it could just be signing a lease with an apartment or something like that. It all meets the requirements. But if you only have the rental contract while food is still an issue for ISM, then the SSI recipient still has to purchase all of their own food in order not to have some sort of ISM reduction. So just keep that in mind, to the extent that food is still kind of on the table for ISM purposes. But also remember that I mentioned before, food stamps are not income. They're not considered unearned income. And so also not going to be an ISM issue. And so if you are on SSI in Missouri, you are generally going to be eligible for some amount of food stamps. And so between SSI money and the food stamps, you might be able to cover groceries if you're careful, or at least your portion of groceries. So that's one way to do it. If you have a rental contract, it needs to be in writing. It doesn't have to be super fancy. You don't have to have a super formal lease, but it does need to spell out who the parties agreeing to the terms are, when it starts and when it's ending, what the monthly amount is going to be and what it covers, and they need to be signed and dated by everybody. One thing that I get asked a lot is, can it be like retroactive? Like, I didn't have one of these in place, but I want to put one in place now. Could I make it active like 2 years ago? And you unfortunately you can't do that. So it could be retroactive to like the first of this month, but not really more than that. One of the, I think, better ways to deal with it when it's a child living in the parent's home is to have a room and board agreement. And there will be, as part of the materials, a template for this that I've provided for you. A room and board agreement, similar to a rental contract. Difference is that a room and board agreement encompasses all the expenses related to someone living in the house, including food. So you're saying they're basically renting a room in my house, and for some fixed dollar amount, I am paying for all of the expenses relating to them being here. So again, this can be in place with a landlord who lives with the SSI recipient or not. I just think it's most of the time going to work best when the landlord lives with the SSI recipient, because you're not often going to find as many scenarios where someone will be willing to cover all of that in one fixed amount of money that is within the range of an SSI recipient's ability to pay, if they don't also live in the household with them. So one of the questions that I also get a lot about these and the rental contracts is how much to charge. There is not a hard and fast rule about what that should look like. The POMS has some language that says, it should be, in line with kind of what the going rate in your area would be. There is a section of the, so the Social Security is arranged in circuits, and there is one circuit of Social Security that covers 5 states, mostly in the South, not Missouri, that says, so long as your room and board agreement says that the rent is equal to at least whatever the 1/3 value of the monthly Social Security amount is at any given time, then that is sufficient. Missouri has not adopted that rule. There is a proposed rule change with Social Security that would make that the rule for every Social Security circuit, so that every state would have that in place. It's not been adopted formally yet, but they are talking about doing that because it has worked out so well in those 5 states where it is the rule right now. Generally speaking, if I were drafting a room and board agreement for someone who only receives SSI, and we put somewhere between $600 and $700 maybe is going to go toward room and board every month, I've never had that not be deemed sufficient, right? Because remember, your room and board is saying I'm renting a room in someone else's house. And yes, they're covering these things, but also I'm not getting like a whole apartment to myself. I'm getting a room in someone else's house. And so the going rate for that is not the same as if I was renting a 1-bedroom apartment all by myself. So I've never had $600 to $700 be an issue with Social Security, and that still leaves you a few $100s a month for that person to kind of just have some money to do other things with and buy other stuff they might need with. And certainly if they didn't have other needs, you could charge $900 a month and just let them keep the difference, right? So it's going to kind of vary based on everybody's individual situation. But as far as what Social Security says, it's just that really kind of vague language about being in line with your area. So we don't really have anything right now that says what's not going to be okay. I can tell you if you do $100 or $200, that's going to be one of those things that might trigger a red flag to have them look into that a little bit more, and that might be problematic. So I wouldn't try and go too low. Plus the other thing that I tell people is if you are a family who is not relying on that money to actually pay the expenses that it's meant to cover, you're free. Once that money is paid to you, you are free to do with it whatever you want. And if what you want to do with it is set up a separate account that you kind of use as a savings account that you know set aside for your disabled child, you're free to do that, right? So if they don't need the extra money, why not take more through the room and board agreement so that you can kind of build up this little nest egg? So there's a lot of things that really we can think through when we're trying to decide how much to charge, but you know, six, seven is going to be, it's not going to be looked at twice, generally. You're going to be fine. If they change the rule to what that one circuit says, where so long as it meets the 1/3 of whatever the monthly benefit amount is, then that would mean that right now, right, if you, so long as you charged at least $315, then you'd be in compliance with the rule. There would be no issue. So we'll see what happens with that. Again, with room and board agreements, they cannot be retroactive. However, if you are someone who has applied for SSI and is not yet approved for it, so we know that that can take a while to happen, you can put a room and board agreement in place that says we're starting it this month, for example. If the person cannot begin paying this month, they can pay us from their back pay once the SSI goes into effect. That's fine. It's just that you can't, if they've already been receiving the benefits, you can't go back 2 years, 1 year, whatever. I mentioned this just, we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but the requirements of those contracts is they have to be in writing. They have to be signed by both parties. When I say both parties, I mean the landlord and the SSI recipient. There are questions, I think, about if the SSI recipient cannot sign for themselves, who can sign for them. So if they have a guardian or conservator, the guardian or conservator can sign for them. If they have an agent on a power of attorney, that the agent can sign for them, or they can sign for themselves, so long as they're competent to do so. But it does have to be signed and dated. Again, it cannot be retroactive. It has to have a start date as in the same month it's signed, or it can have a future month start date. Again, this fair market value thing that we talked about, but what that looks like is going to vary so much that it's really hard to nail down. And the things that I list here: rent amount, what's included in the rent, if anything, right? So if it's just rent and it includes nothing else, then that's what you say. But if it is going to include utilities, if it's room and board, so it's including food and everything, then you need to put that in there. For room and board, because it is really covering everything, it should say they're getting their own bedroom, but it also includes food, use of common areas, all that stuff. What is not included, right? So for example, if let's say you're going to charge $600 a month for room and board, and you want the SSI recipient to pay for the internet from the excess money. So you can say in the room and board agreement, this does not include internet, and then they would pay for the internet with their excess money every month, right? So you want to put that in there. Otherwise, if you have a room and board agreement saying it basically covers everything, people will assume it includes that. And then if there are any dates that where the contract would automatically terminate or automatically renew, you can put that in there. You you can say that it'll just keep going month to month unless someone terminates it in writing, that's fine. You're not gonna have any issues there.
Nikki, can I ask for a clarification before we leave that slide? If
Yeah.
you are both the landlord and the legal guardian, is there a mechanism so that both parties can sign appropriately? I don't know how to word that, but
Yep, you'll just sign really so you can sign in both places. The important thing is to identify the capacity in which you are signing in both of those places. So on the one place, you're going to want to say, sign your name as the landlord. And the other place, you're going to say, I'm signing as the guardian, right? So because you just want to be clear who's agreeing to what in those places, but it's certainly not a problem for the same person to be signing both things so long as they have the authority to do it. And in the template, you'll see there's like, there's a place where you could edit it. So like it has a spot in there that says like legal guardian. So you could take that out if you're not using it. All right, another strategy for not having ISM are ABLE accounts. So ABLE accounts are a wonderful thing. I think I mentioned earlier, came into being in around 2016 is when the federal law went into place, and then each state was sort of tasked with implementing their own program. So Missouri's program went live a little later than that, I believe maybe early 2018, if I remember right. So ABLE accounts the statute is tucked into the same place in the IRS code where 529 accounts are, where you get like college savings plans. So it has all the same tax benefits as a college savings plan. So the money is invested, it grows tax-free. And when they created the regulations for ABLE accounts, for whatever reason, they did not say that if you used ABLE account money to pay for food and shelter, that would be as ISM. So if you use ABLE account money to pay for food and shelter, you do not have an ISM problem. There is no deduction from your monthly benefit because you paid for food and shelter from the ABLE account. It is a loophole that I can't understand why they did, but it's a great one because if you fund an ABLE account right now, you can put up to $18,000 per year into an ABLE account. Each ABLE account beneficiary can have only one ABLE account, and doesn't matter who puts the money into it, the total contributions can only be $18,000 per year. And then, like I said earlier, up to, for SSI purposes, $100,000 is excluded from counting against them. So they could have up to $100,000 and it's not going to keep them from getting SSI payments. If you were to be putting money into that account and then turning around, sometimes it's like a money in, money out thing. Some people will take their SSI check, put the whole thing into the ABLE account, and then from there, they will pay for whatever they need to pay for that month, including things that would be considered food and shelter, right? So that is another way to prevent a reduction in your monthly benefits. Depending on your particular situation, it may still be more ideal to do like a room and board agreement, or maybe even some combination of room and board agreement and ABLE account, but both would be available to you. So long as the other thing with the ABLE account is you are eligible for one only if you became disabled prior to age 26. If that is not the case, then you could not get an ABLE account right now, although the age limit is going to be increased to 46 in January of 2026. So that will open it up to many more people, but right now you have to have been disabled before age 26. So that's another way to do that. So An ABLE account, once you sign up for it, you can tie it to a checking account. So if you had your SSI payment come into a regular checking account, you could set up a transfer to the ABLE account every month. The ABLE account comes with a little debit card, and you would just use that to pay for whatever you have to pay for. So $943 a month, if that's all you put in there, that's going to be less than the $18,000 contribution limit, right? So you're going to be fine. But if you wanted to put more money into the ABLE account for some reason, you might be kind of limiting yourself and how much you could put in there. Also, if you wanted to put money in there for actually saving it rather than just spending it, then you're going to be really tying your hands there as well. So this may not work for everybody, but it is a really good tool for preventing ISM for people. The other thing is, we talked earlier about how it might be possible for the SSI recipient to pay for a lot of their things with their SSI money, but not for everything. So if you are a third party who is needing to contribute money every month in order to make up that shortfall, if you contributed the money to the ABLE account and let them just use the ABLE account to pay for stuff, that would be a way to do it. So in the question we had earlier about how like if you take them to a restaurant, right, and you buy them a hamburger or something, that would mess up the benefits. If you were to put, let's say, $100 into an ABLE account every month, and you take them to the restaurant and just let them swipe their ABLE account card in order to buy their hamburger, they're still using your money effectively, but and getting their hamburger and not getting a reduction in their benefits. So one of the things I like to suggest to people is to sit down and go through the monthly expenses that the SSI recipient is going to have and categorize them as food and shelter or not. Because remember, if it's not food or shelter, we don't have an issue anyways. It's not a problem because it's not ISM. If it is food and shelter, determine who's providing payment for it. If there's some way that we can move that around and have the person paying for that item pay for something else instead, let's do that. If we can put a room and board agreement in place or something else to get rid of any ISM, let's do that, right? Because remember the screen we looked at when we first started, all those different ways your monthly benefit can be reduced every month. Let's take ISM off the table as a way to reduce your payment. And this list of things to do is one way to make that happen. Because if you're not working anyways, you don't have earned income, so that's not an issue. If you take ISM off the table, you don't have that reducing your monthly benefit. And then unearned income, most people don't have that coming in. We won't go into a big talk about that, but that would be stuff like the things we talked about on the screen, but also like special needs trust distributions that aren't done correctly and things like that. So most people don't have a ton of unearned income problems. The biggest one that I see people getting reductions for, honestly, is ISM. So if we can remove that as a problem and get the full $943 a month, then we've really taken a whole lot of the headache out of all of these SSI rules. The other thing is, I saw a number the other day that said something like 80 something percent, 84% maybe, of overpayments that are assessed by Social Security Administration are because of ISM issues. Because there was an ISM reduction that Social Security made sort of after the fact, and then they came back and say, well, we paid you the full amount, but we shouldn't have, so now we've overpaid you and you have to pay us back. 84% because of ISM. If we can sit down and look at this stuff in advance, we can do some things to make that a non-issue, right? Why not? I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker because I think we've talked about so many of the things, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So Jack is 23 and lives in a house his grandparents bought for him because they're very sweet and they wanted him to have a place to live. Grandparents titled the house in a special needs trust. And I know we didn't touch on special needs trust too much tonight, but they created a special needs trust for him. They bought the house and titled it in the trust. Jack is on SSI, right? Buys his own food. His grandparents pay for the taxes, insurance, and utilities for the house. Jack pays for the cable, phone, and the quarterly HOA fee, and Jack does not pay rent to anyone. So the question is there going to be an ISM reduction for Jack's monthly benefit? I'll give you guys a second before I tell you. What do you think? Yes, there will be. And why is that? Because there's no rental liability, right? Jack does not pay any rent or room and board, and an outside person is paying for expenses that are considered shelter. What are those? Taxes, utilities, right? Those two things would be considered. The insurance is not. Remember, insurance is not on that list of 10 things that's considered shelter. Does it matter that the trust owns the house and not the grandparents? And it doesn't, right? Because from Social Security's perspective, all they know is Jack doesn't own the house, right? And frankly, even if Jack did own the house, Jack's not paying his taxes and utilities for the house. And so someone else is, and therefore there's an ISM reduction. When looking at the taxes, again, that gets broken down into a monthly amount since it's only paid once a year. The next question is, which rule are we applying here, right? Are we applying BTR or PMV? So this one is PMV because they're outside the household, right? So in 2024, that's at $334 because that's that 1/3 plus $20. If we could prove that the value of the things that they're paying is actually less than $334 per month, then it would be less than that because this is that rule that has that rebuttable presumption, but we'd have to provide documentation to show that. The other note that I'll make about this is about the HOA fees that I mentioned in there. Doesn't matter that Jack pays those. Generally not. And the reason is because those are not listed on that list of 10 things that are shelter expenses, right? Or household expenses, same thing. But often HOA or COA condo fees include a portion of that is used to pay an expense that is a shelter expense. So for example, a sewer bill. Sometimes it includes gas bills and things like that as well. If it does, then it could be partially counted as ISM. So that's where we get into the weeds a little bit there. Okay, let's go into the next one. Diane just turned 18, still living with her parents. She was recently approved for SSI and is still in special education classes in high school. So she's extended high school until 21, but still living at home and getting SSI. She does not pay any household or food expenses for herself. She lives with mom and dad. They've always paid for things. They're happy to keep doing that. So instead, she uses her SSI money to pay for entertainment, other miscellaneous items, and she puts a portion of her money into her ABLE account each month. So is she going to have a reduction in her benefits? Yes. And again, why? Because she doesn't have any rental liability, right? She does not pay for any of her food or shelter expenses. She does not have a rental contract or room and board agreement with her parents. I want to just pause and make a little comment here because one of the things that happens, and I honestly can't give you any rhyme or reason for why it is, when you are a parent who is helping your newly 18-year-old apply for SSI, right? Or maybe doing it for them depending on their circumstances. And they're living at home, going to continue to live at home. And so you tell Social Security that when you're going through the whole rundown of questions. I have really seen this go both ways. I know families who have children in their 50s living at home, have been receiving SSI since they were 18, who have never had a reduction for ISM and have never had a room and board agreement or anything. So I always get people who say, well, I know, so-and-so has not had this problem. We're going to be fine. And then I have many clients who apply and immediately get a reduction, right? I really think it's just caseworker by caseworker, because the rules say what the rules say. The rules say there's going to be a reduction. So there's always the ability to impose a reduction, as we've talked about this whole time. Why it doesn't happen sometimes, I really couldn't say. It is true that it doesn't happen sometimes. I've definitely seen that. I just don't know why. And I just think you don't want to take the risk that you're the person that they decide to actually apply the rules to, when we know what we need to do to avoid them. So I just like to put that out there. I wish I knew why it happens sometimes and not others, but I really don't. Okay. Does it matter that Diane is still in high school? It doesn't. So her school status really does not matter. The only thing that would potentially make a small difference here, not necessarily for ISM purposes, but for that earned and unearned income stuff, is if she were in college. There are some things that we didn't really go into that would some benefits she could be receiving from school that would not count against her for SSI. Does it help that Diane uses some of her money and puts it into her ABLE account? Like that, does that reduce the issue, the problem here? And it doesn't. For purposes of reducing ISM, it does not. Again, as we talked about earlier, if her parents wanted to put money into that account, they could, and then they could use it, excuse me, for food and shelter, and it wouldn't have any impact. But Diane putting the money in there does not. And again, which rule are we applying? This one is different. This is the DTR rule because it's coming from inside the household. So this is that straight $314 reduction. No rebuttable presumption, no ability to reduce the amount. It's just that straight 1/3.
All right, I'm going to try and bundle these to the best of my ability. Let's have some really quick talk about tax implications of having a rental agreement and charging your family member rent. Is that considered income for a family?
So generally speaking, rent is rental income. Yes. I'm going to give you a very lawyer answer and say it can depend. So I would suggest that you track it and then ask your tax person for their opinion. There might be reasons in your particular situation why you would not need to claim that.
Okay, great. And really quickly, somebody asked if it affects claiming your adult child as a dependent. You can't charge them for a dependent without it impacting your SSI on the front end. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So yes, it's gonna, the 50% rule as far as claiming them as a dependent on your taxes is gonna have an impact on many different benefits. If they're being claimed as a dependent, then that's going to affect SSI, as you said, on the front end. Certainly the tax status Medicaid stuff. I know we're not talking about Medicaid, but it could affect Medicaid benefits. So, yeah.
We have several questions about home repairs and whether or not those can be counted towards cost of shelter, what that looks like.
Home repairs, like modifications to make it.
Not necessarily, even things like, we've got a big plumbing bill this month, or we have one person that's asked, and I think this is a good question, that they installed solar panels. They're not wanting to charge them for the solar panels, but they're saying that the electric bill has dropped significantly, but they're not seeing the savings yet. Can they charge, consider all the higher expenses when they're calculating their rent?
The short answer is yes. And the reason I think that you can is because if we're looking at this, right, the reason that the rule says that there's not gonna be an ISM reduction, when when these contracts are in place, is because Social Security is looking at these as if it was a long arm agreement, like any of us would sign with our landlords, right? And if I sign a contract with my landlord, there is always a potential that my rent is going to increase because there's been some sort of a cost on my landlord's end, right? So I think that general rule still applies between the parties we've been talking about tonight. So yes, I think a rent increase would be fine. I also think that's another reason why I like the room and board agreements, which is kind of like an all-in-one thing. Because if you've got an increase on one side, but then a decrease on another side, you don't always have to go in and like do an equalization of those things necessarily. Because you're just saying, I'm getting this one fixed amount and it's covering everything, and you could kind of just leave it alone. It's a blanket amount and you only need to just raise it if overall the costs go up.
We've got a couple questions about the actual document. Does somebody need to notarize it, witness it? What's recommended?
So it's not required to be witnessed or notarized in order to be valid, just signed and dated. If you wanted to be, kind of extra careful about it, you could have it notarized. But it's not required. So just in the same way, if you signed a lease, you would just sign and date it, and that would be sufficient.
Great, thank you. And so with that rental agreement, you had mentioned something earlier about doing an annual increase or an annual lease, or having something that was more flexible. Can you change the rent for inflation? Do you just need to create a new lease annually? What do you recommend for that?
So you can do a couple of things. You could either do a new one every year, and you can base the change on inflation. If that's the metric you want to use, that's fine. You could always kind of track it with whatever the cost of living increase from Social Security is. Some people do it that way. You can also say in the original agreement, this is going to go up every year on January 1st, according to this thing, whatever it is, right? According to the Social Security's cost of living increase, whatever. So you just identify what it is. You don't have to put the percentage because that's going to be unknown. But then when it is known, then you just increase it and it's fine. So that way you don't have to redo the document every year, but you've already said, here's how I'm going to increase it. And then you just do it.
Okay, that makes sense. The rest of the questions are a little bit more specific individual questions, so I'll just run through those. This is a question about auditing. They said their son has had SSA since 2019, but they haven't been audited. Is it just is there a percentage of people that get audited? I know it's very random.
So the redeterminations did not happen during COVID, basically. So if they started in 2019, it doesn't surprise me they haven't had one yet, because so the public health emergency would have started in 2020. It did not end until like May of last year. And so they've been trying to get through them, but they definitely have not gotten to everybody yet. So you cannot have more than one a year, but it's more common for people to get one every other year at this point. So you will get one, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's not until either later this year or next.
Okay, that's good information. So that means, everybody, that make sure you have got a really good system for keeping your records, because that's going to be really important. We've got a comment that there is a property tax credit someone with disabilities can apply for in Missouri. How does that refund affect SSI?
So that is treated similar to like a tax refund. So when you get a tax refund, you have 9 months to spend it before it's going to count as an asset. So it doesn't count as income at all. And it won't count toward that $2,000 asset limit for 9 months. If you have not spent it within 9 months, then it will count against you.
Great. I think people forget they've got that 9 months to pay
Yes.
off those expenses. So
Right.
that's
Yeah.
great. This guest said, when I was doing my interview and advised my son, who is 18, was paying rent of $600, I was asked how he was paying that as he had no income. How do I answer that question and maximize his benefit amount? When you're going into that Social Security interview,
Mhm.
can you say where, my plan, or he's going to be expected to when he has this income? What is that?
Yeah. And that's sort of why I say, like, if you've got the room and board agreement in place and it says, I always like to put something in there that says, this is what it's going to be. And when he gets his back pay, he'll pay us beginning in this month, right? So then I just show them a copy of that, because that's why they're asking that question. Like, he can't be paying it right now. But if you show them the language in the document, then they'll see it. And in the template that people will get in the materials, it's got that language in there.
I was told by someone in the Social Security office to never put the entire SSI amount in my child's ABLE account. Any idea why?
No. You know, people have lots of their own ideas about why you would do one thing or not. There isn't any, like I said, at $943 a month, you're not going to be going above the $18,000 contribution limit by putting your full check in there every month. And because you can use it on the debit card just like your checking account, it's not like you're going to be on, it's not tied up in such a way that you're not going to have access to the money. So that's probably just their personal opinion about it, I would assume.
Okay. We've got a few more questions. I'm just going to bullet fire them. If there's $700 per month that goes to room and board, are there any restrictions on how the rest of the SSI money is spent?
As long as you don't give it away, no. I mean, it's got
Okay.
to be used for the benefit of the recipient, but that's it.
Okay. When they come back and review your documentation, do they require proof of deposit when charging your child rent?
They will usually ask for the SSI recipient's bank statements, and they will want to see either a transfer from their account to some other account, or like the check written, or however the transfer is being made. But that's usually, they don't usually ask for the receiving person, they ask for the SSI person's materials.
Okay. In your first example, what if a trust pays for the HOA, property tax, etc., and holds the property in the trust? Is the
So the
situation
property,
still a concern that there's no rent being paid, or?
yes, so it's still a rent issue from an SSI perspective, because unless the SSI recipient is paying taxes and other stuff, right? They've got to be paying something. But if the house were owned by the trust and the trust was paying the HOA fees, that's fine. Because remember, HOA fees are not a shelter expense, generally speaking. But if the person was living there and paying nothing at all except for groceries and cable and internet, it's still problematic, because they're not they're not paying rent. So it's their rent is still being provided by someone else.
Okay. Here's a few checking myself questions. If we have a room and board contract that includes food and we go out to eat and pay for our kiddos' meal, is that a problem? Or would the board part of the contract cover eating out?
The board part is generally going to cover that.
Great. If I've claimed my child as a dependent on taxes in the past, should I stop that? Any potential ramifications from the past?
Well, I think the problem with it is, my concern would be that, I don't want to get into the weeds too much on them, but the deeming rules, if you are claiming someone as a dependent, that's when all of the deeming rules come into play about Social Security counting your income and assets toward whether someone's eligible or not. I would worry that if you're claiming someone as a dependent and that even when they're over 18, that Social Security would try to make that argument. I also think if you are claiming them as a dependent and collecting rent from them, you can't have both. So, and then again, from a Medicaid perspective, you're gonna have Medicaid issues. So yeah, I would talk to your tax person to figure out the benefit you're getting from claiming them. If there isn't a super compelling reason to do it, then I don't know that I would.
Okay. We got a couple logistic questions about representative payee. Does it make any difference if the Social Security payment is coming in to the recipient's bank account or the parent's joint account and then transferring money either direction, I guess,
If the parent were the rep payee
for Social Security?
and receiving money into their own account, not like a separate fiduciary account?
I guess they're asking is if the should the SSI payment be sent to the recipient's bank account or could it be sent directly to the parent's account for fair housing? And I'm assuming it's going to be they should have the separate account.
Usually, yes. There are some of the older cases hanging out there where I know the money is going straight to mom and dad's account, but I think Social Security has really gotten away from that more recently where they're making the rep payee open up a separate account.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to say for those of you with ABLE account questions, we have additional information about ABLE on our YouTube page. And if your family member is reluctant to use an online account like that, I would say that the benefits of being able to set up that account and use them to simplify your Social Security information would be a really great selling point. Nikki, anything you'd like to add before we wrap things up?
I co-sign all of that about ABLE accounts and also would say that the customer service people for getting it set up are typically very helpful. So
I do see one more question I want to answer before we close out. And that's just that, is it okay if the SSI checks are going into a joint account that has both mom and daughter's name on it and then divvied out?
generally, yes, that's fine. What Social Security is gonna wanna know, gonna be mostly concerned with is if there's a representative payee, is that person adequately keeping records and reporting to them every year like they're supposed to? If they're not, and the SSI recipient is receiving the money on their own, and they're comfortable with putting the money in the joint account, that's okay. Just know that when they do those redeterminations, they'll ask for the bank statements typically. So as long as whoever the joint owner is okay having Social Security see whatever their stuff might be going on in that account, then they're fine.
Great point. What a great workshop. I think we could have probably answered questions for another half an hour. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate your coming tonight. And thank you, Nikki.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.